Every night, the same stray dog showed up on the street, barking nonstop. Loud, desperate, uncontrollable. At first, people were annoyed, then angry. Windows slammed shut, lights turned off. Someone even threatened to call animal control. Why won't it just leave? But the dog didn't stop. Not for 1 minute. It kept barking like it was trying to warn them about something no one else could see. And by morning, when the truth finally came out, the entire neighborhood realized something terrifying. If that dog had stayed quiet, some of them wouldn't be alive. Hale Street was the kind of place that looked perfect from the outside. Neat lawns, freshly painted fences, a cul-de-sac that curved gently at the end, framed by old oak trees that had grown wide and slow over 40 years of quiet seasons. In autumn, the leaves turned copper and gold, and they drifted down onto the sidewalks in a way that made the whole street look like a postcard. But postcards don't tell you what's happening behind the closed doors. Margaret lived at number 7. She was 62, recently retired, and she spent most of her mornings standing at the kitchen window with a cup of tea that she forgot to drink while it was still warm. Her husband had passed 3 years ago, and the house, which had once felt full, now felt like a museum dedicated to a life that no longer existed. She kept everything exactly as it was. His reading chair, his slippers by the door, the half-finished crossword puzzle from the Sunday he died, pinned under a coffee mug on the side table. She didn't talk much to the neighbors. Not because she was unfriendly, but because somewhere along the way, the habit of talking had quietly faded. The way old wallpaper fades. So gradually that you only notice once it's almost gone. 2 houses down, at number 11, lived a young family. Daniel and Claire had moved in 2 summers ago with their 4-year-old son, Owen, and a collection of cardboard boxes that they still hadn't fully unpacked. Daniel worked long hours at a logistics company downtown. Claire managed a small online business from home while simultaneously managing a child who seemed to be powered by an engine no adult could fully understand. They were kind people, busy people, the kind of people who wave hello when they're rushing to the car and mean to stop and chat next time. But next time never quite arrives. Across the street at number 4 lived Gerald. He was 71, a former electrical engineer, and he had a habit of standing on his front porch in the evenings with a glass of water and surveying the street with the calm, patient expression of a man who had long since made his peace with the world. He knew everyone's cars by sound. He knew when the Hendersons at number 9 stayed up too late because their upstairs light glowed long past midnight. He noticed things quietly, without ever saying so. And then there was the Ewan family at number 14. Though the neighbors mostly called them the quiet ones, because they had lived there for nearly a decade without anyone learning more than their first names. The mother was Rose, the father was Henry, and they had twin daughters who were 12 years old and who walked to school every morning in perfect synchrony, backpacks swinging, ponytails bouncing as if choreographed. These were the people of Hale Street. They shared the same sidewalks, the same garbage collection schedule, the same brief nods in passing, but they did not share their lives. They did not know each other's fears. They did not know each other's sorrows. They coexisted, the way strangers on a train coexist. Politely, carefully, without ever quite touching. The street was quiet most evenings. Pleasantly quiet, the kind of quiet that feels peaceful until you realize it might just be the absence of connection. And it was into this quiet, this orderly, well-maintained, slightly hollow quiet, that the dog arrived. It was a Tuesday night in late October when the dog appeared for the first time. Margaret noticed it first. She was up late, as she often was, sitting in the dark of the living room with the television on and the volume turned low, the way she'd taken to doing since the house got too quiet to sleep in easily. She heard something outside, a soft scratching, then stillness. She pulled back the curtain by a fraction. There it was, standing at the edge of the pool of yellow light cast by the street lamp at the end of her front path. Just standing, still as a stone, looking It was a medium-sized dog. The kind you might call a mutt, though not unkindly. Its coat was a mottled brown and gray, matted in patches, carrying the particular dullness of fur that hasn't been groomed in a long while. It was lean to the point of being gaunt. You could see the ridge of its spine if the light hit at the right angle. One ear stood straight, and the other folded partway over, as if it had given up trying. There was an old scar that ran along its left flank, pale against the darker fur. A memory of something that had once hurt it, written into its body. It wore no collar. It carried nothing. It was simply there. Margaret watched it for a long moment. It did not approach her door. It did not sniff around the bins or scratch at the garden. It only stood and looked. Down the street, past the oak trees, toward the far end of the cul-de-sac. With an intensity that seemed almost purposeful, as if it were standing watch. She let the curtain fall and went back to the low television. At number 11, Daniel was still awake too, finishing emails at the kitchen table. He happened to glance out the window and see the dog, a shadow at the edge of the light, and thought only that it was strange. A stray, probably, lost. It would be gone by morning. It was gone by morning. But it came back the next night, and the night after that. And on the third night, it began to bark. The first bark came just after 11:30, a single, sharp sound that cut through the October silence and made Margaret flinch in her armchair. Then another, then a rhythm, urgent, repetitive, aimed at something she couldn't see. She pulled back the curtain again. The dog was in the same spot, but now its whole body was engaged. Weight forward, head low, eyes fixed down the street in that same direction, barking, not at her, not at the house, at something further away, something at the end of Hale Street, something only it could perceive. Margaret pressed her lips together. She let the curtain fall, and the barking went on. By the end of the first week, Hale Street had decided it had a problem. Gerald mentioned it to Daniel on Friday morning, when they happened to be at the curb at the same time. Gerald putting out recycling, Daniel loading a briefcase into his car. The conversation was brief and functional, the way conversations between near strangers usually are, a mutual acknowledgement of the disturbance, a shared frown, a general agreement that something ought to be done. Claire had lost 2 nights of real sleep already. Owen, 4 years old and operating on the logic of the very young, had decided that the dog was exciting, and that he wanted to see it, which had added an element of small, child, management to the already fractured nights. At number 9, Linda Henderson had gone online to look up ordinances about nuisance animals. She had printed the relevant section on a sheet of paper and taped it to her fridge with a refrigerator magnet shaped like a sunflower. And at number 4, Gerald stood on his porch 2 nights in a row watching the dog. He was less annoyed than the others. Something about it nagged at him, though he couldn't have said precisely what. The dog was not frantic. It was not rabid or erratic or simply noisy in the way a frightened animal might be. It was deliberate. That was the word that kept presenting itself to Gerald's careful engineer's mind. Deliberate, but he didn't say that to Daniel. He only said the barking was disruptive, which was true, and hoped it would resolve itself. It did not resolve itself. By the second week, the mood on Hale Street had shifted from inconvenienced to actively hostile. Someone, no one admitted to it, but Margaret suspected it was Linda Henderson, based on the precision of aim, threw a plastic bottle at the dog from an upstairs window. On a Thursday night, the dog sidestepped it without much apparent concern, and went back to barking. There was talk of calling animal control. Daniel looked up the number on his phone. He didn't call yet, but he saved it. That felt like a warning, even if the dog had no way of receiving warnings. Rose from number 14 tried leaving food near the garden wall 2 nights running. A small bowl of table scraps that she set out with the quiet matter of fact kindness of someone who has learned not to make a show of her compassion. The dog came and ate, which surprised her. Then it returned to its spot near the street lamp and resumed barking, which did not. Her husband Henry shook his head from the doorway. "It won't take the hint," he said. "It's not trying to take a hint." Rose said. It's trying to give one. Henry did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and they went back inside to the sound of the barking. The situation by the end of week 2 had a quality of pressure to it. The kind of pressure that precedes something breaking. It was Gerald who first said it out loud. He said it to himself, standing on his porch at 11:45 on a Wednesday night, watching the dog at its post near the street lamp, listening to the quality of the sound it was making, because the barking had changed. In the first week it had been loud and rhythmic, insistent, like a knock on a door. In the second week it had taken on something else. A pitch that moved, a pattern that felt less like repetition and more like escalation, the kind of sound that communicates not just presence, but urgency. Gerald had spent 30 years as an engineer. He understood systems. He understood the difference between a signal and noise. And he understood that labeling something as noise because it inconvenienced you was not the same as it actually being noise. He watched the dog. The dog was always facing the same direction, not outward toward the wider neighborhood, not toward any particular house on the left or the right side of the street, always toward the far end of the cul-de-sac, toward the cluster of older properties at the very end of Hale Street. The ones that had been there the longest, that had the oldest wiring, the oldest pipes, the oldest bones. That was the night Gerald stopped being annoyed and started paying attention. He went inside and got his coat. He walked to the end of his front path. The dog looked at him. It did not retreat. It did not growl. For just a moment it seemed to still itself, the way animals do when they are caught between two strong impulses, weighing them against each other. Then it turned and looked back toward the end of the street. Gerald looked in the same direction. He saw nothing. Dark houses, parked cars, the silhouettes of the old oaks. He went back inside, but he did not stop watching. Across the street, Claire had noticed it too. The directionality of the barking. She'd been so exhausted that the details had blurred for days. But on Thursday morning, with a mug of coffee in both hands and the particular clarity that sometimes follows bad sleep, she mentioned it to Daniel. It's always pointing the same way, she said. Daniel looked up from his phone. What? The dog. It's always facing the same direction when it barks, down toward the end of the street. Daniel looked at her for a moment, then back at his phone. Dogs do weird things, he said. Claire said nothing, but she kept thinking about it. At number 7, Margaret had begun to watch the dog with something she could not quite name. Not fondness. She wasn't ready for that. More like the careful attention you give to something that refuses to be ignored. She had noticed that the dog, on 2 separate occasions, had moved from its post near the street lamp and walked quickly, purposefully, partway down toward the end of the cul-de-sac, then turned back, then moved again, as if pacing a line, as if pulling at an invisible leash that connected it to something at the end of the street. She thought about that old behavior in dogs, the way they sometimes seem to know things. She didn't say it to anyone, but she thought about it late at night with her cold tea in her hands. The storm came on a Friday. It had been forecast for days. A slow, moving front that had been sitting off the coast and drifting gradually inland, promising heavy rain, strong winds, possible flooding in low-lying areas. By Friday afternoon the sky had turned the particular shade of yellowish gray that precedes serious weather, and the oaks on Hale Street were already moving, their branches dragging against each other with a sound like whispering. By 8 o'clock in the evening, the rain had arrived properly, not the gentle, residential rain that freshens gardens and drums pleasantly on skylights, but the hard, insistent rain of a real storm. Rain that punishes, that finds every gap in every gutter, that turns streets into shallow rivers within the hour. At 9:45, the power went out, not just on Hale Street, the whole block. The street lamps died in sequence down the road. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then there was only the darkness and the rain, and the sound of the wind moving through the trees. Margaret lit a candle. Owen woke up crying and Claire spent 40 minutes getting him back to sleep. which she managed only by lying next to him in the dark and telling him a story she made up on the spot about a brave little rabbit who wasn't afraid of storms. Gerald found a flashlight and sat at his kitchen table with the calm of a man who has survived a great many powerless nights and is not particularly troubled by one more. And outside, the dog was barking, louder than it had ever been. The rain was hammering the street, and the wind was bending the trees and through all of it, cutting through it, insisting over it. Came that sound, not frantic, not random. Desperate. The barking was desperate now. At number 11, Daniel stood at the window with his phone in his hand, looking up the animal control number he'd saved 2 weeks ago. He'd had enough. The power was out. His son had cried for an hour. His wife looked like she hadn't slept properly since October began. And outside in the rain and the dark, that dog would not be quiet. He put his coat on. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do. Drive the dog away, maybe. He stepped out into the rain and walked toward the street lamp end of the driveway, phone torch casting a white beam through the sheets of water. The dog saw him. It stopped barking. For just a moment, the two of them were still. The man in the rain and the wet, gaunt dog, looking at each other across the flooded street. Then the dog turned and ran. Not away. Not up the street toward safety. Toward the end of the cul-de-sac. It ran several meters, then stopped and looked back at Daniel. Daniel stood in the rain, water running off his coat, watching the dog. It barked once, sharp and clear, then it ran further, and stopped, and looked back again, too. Daniel wasn't sure why he followed. Maybe it was the quality of that look. Maybe it was the exhaustion loosening something in him that had been locked. Maybe it was just that Claire's words from that morning were still sitting somewhere in the back of his mind, and he was finally willing to let them surface. He followed the dog. It moved quickly down the center of the flooded street, and Daniel jogged to keep up, his phone torch bouncing off the puddles, the rain turning everything silver and black and unclear. The dog led him past number 12, past 14, past the Ewan house, where a light was now appearing in an upstairs window, and toward the last house on the cul-de-sac, number 18, the Alderton house. Raymond Alderton was 84 years old and lived alone. He had moved to Hale Street with his wife Patricia 41 years ago, and when Patricia died 7 years back, he had simply stayed, the way very old people sometimes stay in the places where they have been most themselves. He didn't drive anymore. His daughter called on Sundays. A carer came Tuesdays and Thursdays. On the other days he was alone. Daniel had spoken to him perhaps 4 times in 2 years. He didn't think about that now. He was thinking about the smell. Because there was a smell, even through the rain, even through the wind, even with the night pressing down, and all the ordinary sensory cues scrambled by the storm. There was a smell, not sharp, not overwhelming, but wrong. The soft, invisible wrongness of gas. Daniel stopped walking. The dog stopped too, and sat. Actually sat, deliberately right at the edge of Raymond's front path, and looked up at him with an expression that, if you were willing to read it that way, said here, it's here. Daniel's phone was in his hand already. He called emergency services first. Gas leak. He told them, residential address, possible risk to occupant. Then he turned to the house and knocked. No answer. He knocked harder, tried the handle. Locked. He ran to the side gate, which was bolted but not padlocked, and when he forced it and went through to the back of the house, he found the kitchen window cracked open. Cracked open by the wind, which had done him the one accidental favor of the evening. He pushed it wider and called Raymond's name into the dark. A groan, a very old man's groan, slow and confused, from somewhere inside. Gerald appeared at the end of the path 2 minutes later. He had seen Daniel's torch from his window, and something in the direction of it had sent him out without him quite deciding to come. Then Rose was there, with a coat over her pajamas. Then Margaret, who had walked down the street through the rain with her candle still lit, though the wind had put it out halfway. because the sound of the barking had stopped, and the silence had frightened her more than the noise ever had. They got Raymond out through the back door and into the air. He was conscious, disoriented. He had smelled something earlier, he said slowly, sitting on the wet garden path with Gerald's coat around him. And he had called his daughter, but she hadn't answered, and he had been very tired. And then he had simply lain down on the sofa because he had felt so very tired. And he hadn't been able to understand why. The emergency services arrived 10 minutes later. A gas fitting behind Raymond's cooker had failed. Slowly, probably over the course of several days, the leak building so gradually that a man who had lived alone for 7 years and wasn't expecting to smell anything unusual had simply breathed it in and felt only a deepening heaviness that he had attributed to his age and the damp in his bones. If Raymond had remained inside that house through the night, in a sealed space while a storm drove out the possibility of him opening windows or going outside. The paramedic did not finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Daniel stood at the edge of Raymond's front garden in the rain and understood. The dog had known. It had known for days. It had been standing at the far end of Hale Street, facing this house, barking at this house, trying to say this house. And no one had understood it, because they had not been willing to listen. He looked around for the dog. It was gone. 2. The emergency vehicles were on Hale Street for most of the night. By midnight, there were 2 gas authority vans, an ambulance, and a fire tender, all their lights strobing through the storm, turning the wet street into a slow pulse of blue and orange. Raymond was taken to hospital as a precaution. He was walking and talking, which was something, and the paramedics said there was no reason to fear any lasting harm, which was something more. Daniel called Claire from Raymond's garden, and she came out in her rain jacket, Owen asleep on her hip, because she couldn't leave him and couldn't stay inside while Daniel was out here, in the middle of whatever this was. She stood next to her husband in the rain and looked at the lit-up house at the end of the sack and didn't say anything for a long time. Margaret stood with Gerald near the garden wall. She was soaked through. She had not thought to bring a proper coat, only her cardigan, which was now doing nothing useful. But she didn't feel cold in the way she expected to feel cold. She felt something else, something that occupied the place cold usually occupied, but was entirely different in character. She felt it very clearly when the paramedics said he was very lucky. Lucky. As if luck had anything to do with it. Gerald put his hand briefly on Margaret's shoulder, and she let him, and neither of them spoke. The fire tender ran its checks, and the gas authority men sealed off the line, and the rain went on, and the lights strobed, and in that strange blue and orange world on a street that had never been anything but quiet, the people of Hale Street stood together in the rain and felt the weight of what had almost happened. At one point, Rose leaned over to her husband Henry and said, very quietly, "The dog." Henry nodded. She said, "We should have listened." He nodded again. "We should have looked," she said. She didn't say anything else, but she cried, a little, in the dark and the rain, and Henry put his arm around her, and neither of the twins, still asleep upstairs, knew any of it. When Raymond came home from hospital 2 days later, Daniel was waiting at the door to help him inside. Morning came the way mornings always do after bad nights. Slowly, grayed at the edges, carrying a silence that felt earned rather than empty. The storm had passed. The street was wet and littered with leaves and a few small branches. But the damage was less than it might have been. The oak trees were intact. The cars were fine. The gas line at number 18 was sealed, and the air was clear, and the only evidence of the night before was the scuffed marks in Raymond's garden path and the lingering memory that would take longer to fade than any physical trace. People came out early that morning, not to go anywhere, not on schedules. They came out the way people come out after something has shaken them loose from themselves. Uncertain, a little raw, needing the simple reality of open air and other faces. Margaret was the first, sitting on her front step with a cup of tea. She was actually drinking while it was still warm, watching the street lighten. Daniel came out next, stood in the driveway, hands in pockets. He nodded at Margaret. She nodded back. Gerald emerged with his glass of water. Same ritual, different meaning today. Claire brought Owen out in his rain boots, and he jumped immediately into a puddle, and then looked up at her for her reaction. And she laughed, which surprised her. They gathered, in small increments, at the middle of the street. Not formally. Not with any plan, just the way people gather when they have shared something that changes the weather between them. They talked about Raymond. Gerald said he would organize a meal rota until Raymond was fully back on his feet, and before he had finished the sentence, Margaret had volunteered for Mondays and Wednesdays. Rose said she would do Tuesdays. Claire said she could do Fridays. Daniel, who had never cooked for anyone he didn't know well, quietly said he would figure out Saturdays. They talked, for the first time in any sustained way, to each other. And they talked about the dog. Everyone had noticed something different, and when they gathered the pieces together, on that wet morning, a picture emerged of an animal that had arrived in their neighborhood, recognized a danger that none of them had perceived, and for 2 full weeks had done everything within its capacity to make them understand. It had stood in their street. It had faced the problem. It had barked not to be difficult, not to disturb, but because it was trying, with the only language available to it, to tell them something was wrong, and they had wanted it gone. The silence that followed that particular observation lasted several seconds. Then Daniel said, "I want to find it." And that was all he said. But it was enough. They looked for the dog that morning. Daniel drove slowly through the surrounding streets, while Claire and Margaret walked the block on foot, calling in the way you call for a dog you don't yet know the name of. Generally, hopefully, in a voice that tries to promise safety. Gerald walked the length of Hale Street and the park beyond. Rose took the twins and checked the area around the supermarket car park, which was where strays sometimes gathered. They found it, finally, under the low hedge at the very end of Raymond Alderton's front garden. It was lying on its side. Not dead. Its eyes opened when Margaret crouched down and spoke to it softly, but exhausted in a way that went deeper than sleep. The kind of exhaustion that collects over a long time in a creature that has been asking something of the world and receiving nothing back, and has finally been listened to, and can now allow itself to stop. Margaret sat down on the wet garden path beside it. She put her hand on its flank. She could feel it breathing. She sat there for a long time. They named him Scout. Not immediately. These things take a few days, and naming something is a kind of commitment, and they needed a little time to arrive at it honestly. But Scout felt right when it was finally said, and it stuck, the way the right name always does. His age turned out to be somewhere between 4 and 6 years, according to the vet. His scar was old, perhaps from a car accident in an earlier life, perhaps something else. He had been, somewhere along the way, somebody's dog, and then he had not been, and he had learned to live in the space between, which is one of the harder things to learn. Margaret took him in. She had not intended to. She had told herself firmly, on the morning they found him, that she was too old and too alone to take on a dog, and that she was simply making sure he received proper care until a rescue placement could be arranged. She told herself this with great conviction for approximately 48 hours, during which time Scout lay on an old blanket on her kitchen floor and looked at her with the particular patience of an animal that understands waiting. On the 3rd day, she moved his blanket to the living room. On the 5th day, she bought him a proper bed. On the 7th day, she stopped pretending. Hale Street changed in the months that followed. Not dramatically, not in ways that would be visible to a stranger passing through. The lawns were still neat, the fences still freshly painted, the oaks still turned copper in autumn and dropped their leaves onto the sidewalks. But the windows were open more often. People stopped and talked. Actually talked, for more than 30 seconds, about more than the weather or the garbage schedule. Daniel started walking Owen down to Gerald's house on Sunday mornings. because Owen had decided that Gerald was interesting, and Gerald had begun to suspect that this small, energetic child was the best thing to happen to his Sunday mornings in quite some time. Rose and Margaret had lunch together every second Tuesday, which had begun as a practical coordination of Raymond's meal rota and had evolved into something else entirely. The way good things sometimes do, Henry fixed the gate on Margaret's side fence that had been sticking since spring, not because she asked but because he noticed, and because noticing now seemed like something worth doing. Raymond, recovered and sharper than anyone had given him credit for, had taken to sitting in his front garden in the afternoons when the weather allowed. Margaret brought Scout along most days, and Raymond would scratch the dog's ears and say nothing in particular, and Scout would sit beside him with a steady contentment that seemed to belong to an animal who had found its purpose and its rest in the same place. There were evenings when Scout would stand at the edge of Margaret's front path and look down the street, the way he always had. And the neighbors, if they were outside, would look too, not in fear, not in annoyance, in a kind of shared habit that had grown out of that terrible, important night. Looking, paying attention, as if they'd learned, finally, that the world doesn't always send its warnings in forms you immediately understand. Sometimes it sends a stray dog, a dirty, gaunt, unlovely stray dog, with one ear up and one ear bent, and an old scar on its flank, and no collar, and nothing to offer but its voice and its persistence, and its refusal to be silent about what it knows. And sometimes, if you are willing to stop, and listen, and follow, that is enough. There is a kind of wisdom the world offers that doesn't come wrapped in the forms we expect. It doesn't arrive with credentials. It doesn't announce itself politely. It doesn't wait for you to be ready, or rested, or in the right mood. It comes in the middle of the night when you want to sleep. It makes noise when you want quiet. It stands in your way when you want to move past it. And if you throw things at it, if you curse it, if you look up the number to have it taken away, it simply waits, and then it comes back, and it tries again. The people of Hale Street had thought they had a problem. They had thought the problem was the dog. They had spent 2 weeks managing their inconvenience instead of questioning it, looking inward at their interrupted sleep instead of outward at the thing that was trying, with everything it had, to make them look outward. That is a very human thing to do. We mistake discomfort for malfunction. We treat the things that disturb us as problems to be solved rather than signals to be read. We organize ourselves so thoroughly against inconvenience that we stop being able to hear what the inconvenience is saying. Scout had known about the gas leak for days. His nose, built for exactly this kind of knowing, wired from the first breath a dog takes to detect the invisible things the world is made of, had understood what his barking was trying to say. He had stood his post in the cold and the rain and the dark, and he had said it as clearly and as continuously as he could, and the street had tried to silence him, and then one person had followed. That is all it takes, sometimes, one person willing to follow the uncomfortable thing, instead of shutting the window against it. One person willing to say, what if it's right? Daniel had not been a brave man that Friday night in the storm. He had been a tired man with a phone in his hand, and a coat that wasn't quite waterproof, standing in a flooded street, looking at a dog he had resented for 2 weeks. He had simply been tired enough, and curious enough, and perhaps something in Claire's observation had been living in him long enough, that when the moment came, he moved toward rather than away. That is sometimes how the important things happen. Not heroically, not in a moment of grand clarity, but in the particular tiredness that is close enough to honesty that the pretenses drop, and you see what you were already seeing, but were not yet willing to admit. Raymond Alderton is alive on Hale Street today, because a stray dog would not be silent and a tired man followed it through a storm. The dog had no way of knowing that it would matter. It had no guarantee that anyone would come. It had been abandoned before. The scar said so. The thinness said so. The absence of a collar said so. It had been in the world long enough to know that effort is not always rewarded, that doing the right thing is not always received as the right thing, and it came back anyway, every night, and barked. Because something needed saying. Think about the last thing that disturbed you, the thing you wanted to push away, the sound you wanted to silence, the difficulty you worked so hard to rot around. Think about whether you asked, even once, what is this trying to tell me? Sometimes the answer is nothing. Sometimes discomfort is only discomfort, and the uncomfortable thing is only in the way. But sometimes the thing keeping you up at night is trying to save your life, and you will only know which one it is if you follow it. A scout lived on Hale Street for 11 years. He slept at the foot of Margaret's bed and walked the block every morning with the particular authority of an animal who has earned his place and knows it. The neighbors spoiled him, collectively, beyond any reasonable nutritional recommendation. Raymond Alderton, for his part, outlived the actuarial tables by a comfortable margin, and credited this to fresh air, regular meals, and the daily company of a dog who had very strong opinions about which garden paths needed investigating. The street remained quiet, as it had always been, but it was a different kind of quiet now, the kind that comes from people who have chosen to see each other and know what they have in the choosing. The kind of quiet you can rest in,